Hi, this is John Perkins.
Hi, I'm Craig Bell. There's a story of a Mrs. Monroe from Darlington, Maryland, who was the mother of 8 children. She came home one afternoon from the grocery store and noticed it was quite a bit quieter than usual. She looked in the living room and she saw 5 of her darling children sitting in a circle. They were all playing with 5 of the cutest little skunks you'd ever seen. She was instantly terrified and she screamed, "Run, children, run!" Each child grabbed a skunk and ran in 5 different directions. Her scream so scared the children that each one squeezed his skunk. Yeah, it's never a good thing to panic. So let's talk today about 3 ways you can face your problems without panic. That's today on Take 5.
Food for the soul, helping you to thrive. 5 minutes to renew your mind. Take 5.
So today we're going to look at the story of David and Goliath found in 1 Samuel chapter 17. It's a great example of how to face a problem that's bigger than you and not panic. There's some things we can learn from the story of David and Goliath. We all know the story. David's dad, Jesse, sent him to check on his brothers who were in war, sent him with some cheese and some things for the brothers. And when he got there, he found that Goliath was on the battlefield defying God and defying the armies of God. As we look at this story, there's several things that we can apply to our lives that will help us face the problems that we face from day to day. A wise man once said that there are 3 kinds of people in the world: those who have come through a problem and just got out, those who are in a problem right now, and those who are headed into a problem. So you're one of those 3 because we all face problems, don't we? It's a part of life. But hopefully today we can learn a few things that will help us. 3 things, particularly through the problems of life. First thing, don't let your problems dictate your actions. If you look in 1 Samuel chapter 17, you'll notice that Goliath in verses 8 and 9 set the battle plans for the enemy. So they allowed Goliath to put down the rules for how battle was going to go. Never let the enemy lay down the battle plans. Here's what he said in verse 8 and 9. He says, "If you send out a man to fight and he beat me, we'll serve you. If I beat him, you serve us." And they began battle on his terms. Number 1 mistake: don't let your problems dictate your actions. When Goliath began to speak, what did the army of Israel do? Verse 24, they fled from him and were sore afraid. Yeah, it's the same reaction you and I would have, right? Well, it is if we let our problems dictate our actions, because our natural reaction would be to let fear hinder any action that we would have. David goes forward, probably afraid. Yeah, I'm sure he's afraid. He's a young boy at this time in his life, and he's facing a giant. So no doubt he's afraid, but the fear does not hinder him from going into action and what he knows he needs to do. So that's the first tip. Don't let your problem dictate your action. Number 2, don't measure your problems with a man-sized standard. When he goes to Saul, Saul looks him over and says, "You're just a kid." So he was measuring David by a man-sized standard. Goliath sees David in verse 42, and Goliath says to David, "You're just a youth." Verse 43 says, "Am I a dog that you would come to me and fight?" He was judging him by the standard of man. He was measuring him according to his measurements, his size, looking at David as a youth. David looked at Goliath and he measured Goliath on God's standards. See, David's not lining up himself with his problem. He's lining his problem up with God, God's size. So the standard that he measures his problem with is God, not man. Yeah, see, the first thing we want to say is, it's bigger than me. Well, of course it is. But is it bigger than God? That's the question. Don't measure your problem with a man-sized standard. And then number 3, don't own it. David says to Goliath in verse 47, he says, "The battle is the Lord's." David said, "This isn't even my fight. It's God's fight, not mine." Your problem is big. I understand that. The battle is fierce. I know that. But don't own it. Don't put your name on the deed, man. Put God's name on the deed. This is God's battle after all. When Moses was at the Red Sea with the children of Israel, he said to them, "Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord." In Psalms 46, verse number 10, it says, "Be still and know that I am God." In other words, stop your efforts and be still. Don't put your name on the battle. Put God's name on the battle. It's his battle, and watch what he can do. So don't become immobilized by fear with your problems. Don't measure your problems by you. Measure them by God. Not how big you are, how big God is. And then don't own it. Don't put your name on it. It's God's battle. When you give it to God, it becomes his. Now, David had to throw the rock, sure, but it was all on God's terms and God's strength under God's protection. And it became God's victory. Friends, if you'd like to hear more words of encouragement, you can find us on Facebook under Old Fashioned Revival. One.